In this lesson, we'll introduce the concept of natural selection and a little bit about how Darwin arrived at the idea. Darwin began his career as a naturalist aboard the HMS Beagle, which was a ship that set sail from England on a 5-year journey around the world. And Darwin's job was to make observations of plants and animals and take notes of geology of all the different places he visited. He collected specimens and examined them and brought many back to England. Interestingly, in the beginning of his journey, he was by no means a radical thinker. He accepted the Christian view of the natural world. He was well versed in William Paley's writings, and he accepted the idea that God had created species separately in a separate act of creation at some time in the past, and equipped members of species with their adaptations. So God's intelligence was the explanation for the parts with purposes that we found in nature. However, by the end of the 5-year journey, Darwin began to question his prior views. His observations over 5 years, the reading that he did, his thinking about the subject matter, led him to the view that species, in fact, could change. They did not have an essence, as Paley believed, but rather species were changing over time. And the nature of that change seemed to be that they could adapt. They could become better fit for their local environments over time. And that process of adaptation also might account for the origin of new species from existing species. So one species might be able to turn into two species if species were changeable. When Darwin returned to England then, this is his home outside of London, that's how it looks today. When he returned to England then, his great challenge was to figure out how species might be changing in nature. What was the mechanism, what was the process that was going on to drive species change? So Darwin would spend the next 20 years here, in fact the rest of his life, amassing evidence that species changed. And those were the kinds of evidence we've saw before, the fossil record and comparative anatomy and the distribution of species and the groupishness of species and embryology, etc. So he will make the case that species have in fact changed, but then also try to figure out what the mechanism of that change is. So in thinking about what kind of process could change species over time, he kept his eyes open for anything that would have any bearing on that question. And it occurred to him that there was something that was sort of like species changing over time. And you could easily see it if you just visited a nearby farm. And that, of course, were all the animals and plants that humans had been breeding for a long time. Now, take the animals here. Lots of farmers had been breeding cattle for increased milk production and meat production, for example, and goats for milk production, and pigs for meat production, and horses for speed, and dogs for all kinds of different body shapes and behaviors. And so we can think of this as a selection process where humans get to decide which individuals, which males and females will mate. And the criterion for who gets to mate is whatever the breeder wants, whatever kind of trait that the breeder is trying to create, then that will determine which individuals in a population will get to make offspring. So humans have been doing this for a long time with animals and plants. Here, the wild mustard plant was used in selective breeding programs to produce all kinds of different types of vegetables that we have today. So for Darwin, this was an important observation. The fact that humans could change plants and animals through a selection process led him to suggest that a selection process had great power. So Darwin appreciated the power of a selection process to change species. If we humans could be changing animals and plants, perhaps something like a selection process was happening in nature. And this, of course, is what Darwin will argue. He calls the process natural selection to distinguish it from what we might call artificial selection, where we humans are consciously doing the selecting. But in nature, it would be natural selection, and he will argue that this is the most important way that species change in nature. Now, let's walk through his reasoning here, and we'll sort of appreciate how he arrived at this insight. So first, let's consider three facts, and these facts would have been known to any naturalist of the day. Fact one, there's a potential rapid increase of any population. Fact two, populations appear to remain fairly constant in nature. So let's just think a moment about that. Take rabbits out in the woods. So rabbits can make lots and lots of babies. They reproduce very easily, right? But wait, we don't see the woods filled with rabbits. We're not overrun with rabbits. Something is going on to keep rabbit populations in check. Fact three gives us an idea here. Environmental factors limit populations, like predators or disease or starvation. But from these three facts, Darwin is going to make an inference. And again, he's not the only one who understood this, but we're going to say that from facts 1 to 3, we'll make our first inference that there is a struggle for existence in nature. And that means that there are many more babies that are born every generation than can possibly survive and go on to reproduce. So lots of individuals are not going to survive to reproduce. So in the case of, say, the giraffes here, the struggle, we can think of it as a struggle to reach high food, right? Okay, so a struggle to get enough food. But there are all kinds of other struggles that species would encounter, struggling with the climate, or struggling against predators, or struggling against individuals of your own species. So we want to understand the struggle in a very broad way. But just the struggle captures this idea that many more individuals are born than can possibly survive to reproduce. Now at this point, Darwin's going to ask a simple but profound question. Who will win the struggle for existence? And Darwin's answer is going to be our fact number 4. And again, this would be agreed upon by everybody, but Darwin is going to understand the significance of this. So fact 4, individuals in a population show variation in traits. So in a natural population, not every individual is identical. There are variations in their characteristics. Traits is what biologists sometimes call these things. So for example, in our giraffes here, we have here shown variation in the length of the neck. And so every generation there seems to be this kind of variation in these traits. Some individuals have traits that make them more likely to survive than others in their population. For giraffes, the length of the neck happens to be a trait that's really important for getting food from high places, from trees, right? So variation in that particular trait really could influence survival. So individuals with the longer necks are going to have a greater chance of getting enough food and surviving to become parents. Well, so what if some win? Well, consider fact 5. Much of the individual variation in animals and plants is heritable. And again, the animal and plant breeders did know this, but Darwin saw great significance in this fact. So heritable means that a trait can be passed on. So consider fact 4, that there is variation and that the variation is heritable. That's going to lead Darwin to his important second inference. The inference, number 2, is the concept of natural selection. So given the context of a struggle for existence, that was inference 1, and the observation of heritable variation in populations which influenced survival, facts 4 and 5, the most fit traits, right, the most suitable traits, the most useful traits then, will become more frequent in future populations. And this is what we mean by natural selection. That those traits that are causing greater survival, right, greater success in a particular environment, those traits will become more common, more frequent in future generations. So that's going to be causing species to change, to become better adapted to their environment. And so this is the idea that species are not fixed. Darwin's arguing that as they struggle, right, in nature, they are being changed as a result of that struggle. Because there's variation and that variation is heritable, those individuals with useful variations in their traits will have more babies. And so future populations will be changing as a result of that. The useful traits will be increasing in the population, and that is a change in the species. Now let's make a distinction between some vocab terms here. So we're going to say, over time, the natural selection causes the evolution of adaptations. Now let's examine what these two words mean here. So useful variations will increase in future populations. This is called evolution. So evolution is referring to this process where in future populations, the useful traits are becoming more and more common because individuals with those traits are having more babies and passing them on to their offspring. The trait itself, the one that's causing greater survival, is the adaptation. In the case of giraffes, it would be the long neck, would be the adaptation. So this is a feature of a creature that is heritable and helps survival and reproduction. Evolution, that word refers to how the populations are changing over time. That traits, the frequency of useful traits is increasing in the population over time, generation after generation. Okay, so let's take another look then at this process of natural selection with our giraffes. So here at the top we'll have some ancestral population of giraffes, and notice they have kind of short necks, so the average neck length is sort of short. And today we have giraffes where the average neck length is long. And today we would say that long neck is an adaptation, so it's a species-wide adaptation. But what we want to try to understand is, how do you go from an ancestral population of short-necked individuals to the long-necked ones today? And Darwin's answer is going to be natural selection. So here are some of the relevant concepts, and we'll see how they apply to the picture here. So first, the struggle for existence. So in this ancestral generation, not all the individuals will make it to reproduce on their own, right? Some are going to starve, or some might get eaten by predators or get disease or whatnot. So there is a struggle for existence. And in that context, it's really important that there is variation in the population. So trait variations exist. In this case, we'll just focus on the length of the neck as a very important variation in a trait. Well, there are going to be winners in the struggle. Certain variations cause better survival and reproduction rates. So in other words, longer necks are causing greater survival. Those individuals can get more food, and so they'll be more likely to survive and be able to have babies. Well, then we get to the reproduction stage here. The survivors are the ones that get to be the parents. They survive because of a useful variation. And then they go on and pass that trait on. That's the hereditary component here. Offspring inherit the traits that made their parents win the struggle for existence. But importantly, there's always new variation each generation. And we'll kind of see that. We see this every generation. So notice in the original generation, the average neck length is short. Over time, with new generations, average neck length is getting longer, but each generation there still is variation. And that was important. So while Darwin noticed that parents do pass on many parental traits to their offspring, there are also lots of new traits in the offspring, new variations. And this is true of animal and plant reproduction. Now, Darwin didn't really understand where these variations were coming from. He did not know about DNA. Today we know there are mutations and there's shuffling of genes that produce variation. But he did not know the source of the variation. However, he did appreciate the significance of the variation. So, for example, in this generation here, the long-necked individuals are going to have an advantage. Maybe this one and this one and this one. So maybe this one here is going to die of starvation. Maybe this one gets eaten by a predator, right? But the long-necked ones then are going to pass on that long neck to offspring. But there will be some offspring that will have shorter necks than the parents, but some will have even longer necks. So the fact that there's new variation each generation provides new fuel for evolutionary change. So here in this generation, the longer-necked individuals will have an advantage. So when they make babies, many of them will inherit this same size of a neck, but some will be shorter, some will be even longer. And again, every generation then, the longest-necked individuals will have the survival advantage. But it's the generation of new variation, every generation, that really provides the fuel for evolutionary change there. Now let's also consider what it is that's selecting here. From Darwin's point of view, we would say that sort of the high trees are selecting the trait of a long neck. So in other words, the nature of the food availability means that long neck is being favored by those trees. So the selection process is favoring long necks. It's as though the trees are allowing the long neck ones to survive, and the trees are penalizing the short necked ones. So this is why Darwin wants to call this a selection process. Something in nature, in this case the availability of food high up, that is selecting the trait of long necks. Now let's, to wrap this up, just to compare Paley and Darwin one more time. In Paley's view, you recall, God created the first giraffes, and they reproduced to make more giraffes. Now, Paley might have admitted that there were slight variations in giraffes in the wild, but for Paley, this was not important. It was insignificant. For Paley, they all had the same essence. Variations were not really important at all. And this is one of the reasons why Darwin is so a kind of a radical thinker, or he was so insightful, because he understood the significance of variations in the population. So for Darwin, the variation in giraffes means that animals have the potential to change. Because if there is a survival advantage to any of these variations, then you will have a selection process where those individuals with the most useful variation will preferentially survive, have more babies, and if that variation is heritable, then over time you're going to get a change in the species. So the variation in traits gives species the potential to change in certain ways. And the ways they're changing is to become better and better adapted to their local environments. So there are factors in the environment that are selecting from among this variation which traits are going to survive better than others. And that's the process that Darwin called natural selection. So if we think about just sort of some metaphors for understanding species, Paley is going to see species almost like sort of that animals are stone sculptures, right? So they just don't change very much. They're very fixed and rigid. Darwin would make a different metaphor, right? So animals are clay sculptures. They are modifiable. Species are modifiable as they struggle for existence in their local environments. How are species modified? They are modified by factors in the environment, like predators and availability of food and disease and etc. So all of these factors are selecting from among variations in traits, and those selected traits then become more common in future generations, and we would say the population is evolving. They are evolving adaptations to whatever those selection factors are.